We should remember that that there are Islamist tendencies in Russia, especially in breakaway republics, separatist tendencies and Islamist tendencies, and there are quite a few groups that dislike the Kremlin for reasons completely different from the reasons that Ukraine dislikes the Kremlin or that Western governments dislike the Kremlin. And those groups clearly spotted an opportunity now that Russian authorities are so obsessed with Ukraine and uncovering Ukrainian plots, real or imagined, everywhere they turn.
Russia has marked a day of mourning today following a terror attack in Moscow that claimed the lives of at least 137 people. Two suspects have also appeared in court in Moscow. ISIS have claimed responsibility, but Vladimir Putin has sought to link the attack to Ukraine, a claim that international intelligence services have claimed is untrue. Well, meanwhile, Russia has launched a series of air attacks targeting critical infrastructure in Kyiv and western Ukraine, with one cruise missile breaching Polish airspace earlier. Millions of Ukrainians have been left without electricity over recent days in what officials in Kyiv describe as the war's biggest assault on energy supplies. Well, Elisabeth Braw is an expert on Russia and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and joins us tonight. Elizabeth, hello, good evening.
Good evening.
Can we get to the bottom of something that is quite an important element of this story, which is that the US and US intelligence had warned Russian intelligence that the likelihood of this attack or an attack like this was increasing. Do we understand that to be true?
That is indeed the case. It has been confirmed by the White House. And this is something the US regularly does. They have very good intelligence. And when they see something that requires warning the prospective victims, then they do warn the prospective victims or the prospective victim country, even if it's an adversary in some cases. And that's what they did this time. And they've done it countless times with friends and allies, countries that may have otherwise been subjected to terrorist attacks, and they did it this time, and they even put it on the embassy website, in the website of their embassy in Moscow. So it was nothing secret about it, but the Russians refused to pay attention to it.
Why?
It has to do with the nature of an autocrat. So an autocrat always thinks he's always right, and the longer you remain in power as an autocrat, the more convinced you become that you're always right, and so you refuse to listen to other opinions, other people's insights, and you also become very paranoid. So this seems to have been the case this time. So the US informed Russia, and some Russian official brought it to Putin, but I don't think very enthusiastically, because he wants to bring this kind of bad news. And we don't know exactly what transpired, but the Russians claimed it was some sort of American plot to divert Russia's attention away from Ukraine, and they kept focusing on Ukraine. And here we are. The attack has taken place, and now, unsurprisingly, the Russians are blaming Ukraine.
And to sort of get to the sort of slightly conspiratorial end of the speculation around this story, Elizabeth, some suggesting that maybe that was purposeful, that Putin and the security services have benefited from this in some way and been able to sort of morph it into their narrative against Ukraine. I don't feel massively comfortable with that. That feels conspiratorial to me, Elizabeth, but I don't know. What do you think?
It feels conspiratorial, but the point is that whatever happens in Russia, whatever bad happens in Russia, the Kremlin will blame it on Ukraine. So we don't even need to guess next time something happens. And other bad things will happen, either as a result of human error, or as a result of terrorist activity, or whatever else may pop up. But the Kremlin will blame Ukraine in every case.
And I mean, this is not to endorse those conspiratorial ideas, Elizabeth. But one thing that did sort of fascinate me is how something like this is plotted and carried out in a country so famous for quashing dissent.
We have to remember that the Russian government, Russian authorities, are so strongly focused on Ukraine, and it feels like they are almost on the path of thinking about Reds under the beds, but instead it being Ukrainians under the bed. So they are so obsessively focused on Ukraine that apparently they have forgotten about other threats. And we should remember that there are Islamist tendencies in Russia, especially in breakaway republics, separatist tendencies and Islamist tendencies. And there are quite a few groups that dislike the Kremlin for reasons completely different from the reasons that Ukraine dislikes the Kremlin or that Western governments dislike the Kremlin. And those groups clearly spotted an opportunity now that Russian authorities are so obsessed with Ukraine and uncovering Ukrainian plots, real or imagined, everywhere they turn.
The latest news tonight, then, Elizabeth, is that these two suspects have appeared in court in Moscow. Obviously, at the moment, they remain suspects. But I suppose, help me understand this from as far as what this means for Vladimir Putin, who's attempted to sort of embroil Ukraine in this. If a court is to find that or if it's sort of easy to find a motive or an association between these suspects and ISIS, along with ISIS claiming responsibility and also releasing new footage, and the international community saying that ISIS are involved, does that sort of just completely undermine, unpick, and destroy Vladimir Putin's narrative, or is he sort of somehow trying to claim that ISIS and are involved with Ukraine, that Ukraine were involved with ISIS?
Well, it will be interesting to see what sort of narrative the prosecutors put forward, and indeed how the judges react, because this is really a case where we can measure in very real terms the independence of the Russian judiciary. Now, for some time, the Russian judiciary has not been particularly independent, but you would think in a case like this, where it seems obvious to everybody else that it was ISIS, had nothing to do with Ukraine, if the prosecutors still allege that it was some sort of connection to Ukraine, if the judges go along with that, despite it being such a far-fetched theory. So I think from a legal perspective, this will be a fascinating case to watch. And we should remember that there are several other cases where the judiciary's independence is under scrutiny, including the case of the Wall Street Journal reporter who is currently on trial in Russia.
Yeah, an anniversary this week at some point, I think, perhaps in the last few days, Elizabeth, of Evan Gershovich's detention in Russia.
Indeed. And if you look at his case, just like this case of the terrorist attack, the international community, independent observers, all come to one conclusion: he was just doing his job, just as we have come to the conclusion that this was a terrorist attack perpetrated by ISIS. But Russian prosecutors and the Russian government present a completely different picture, which is why it's so fascinating. It will be so fascinating to see whether these judges do have professional pride and do assess the case on these respective cases on their merits, or just go along with what the Kremlin wants them to do.
How has this been met in Russia? I mean, do you have any idea how this is kind of being reported and understood by Russian citizens?
What is true about Russia is that Russian citizens, the Russian public, doesn't have access to independent information. Yes, they can access the internet, but the main way in which they receive their news is through television, which is completely dependent on the government. So no doubt they will, most Russians, if we were able to poll them independently, they would still tell us that this was a plot by Ukraine, simply because with this sort of overwhelming propaganda advantage for the government side of the story, it's almost impossible to get through with facts. And this is really frightening, that we as the West, or indeed as any independent news outlets, really struggle to get through to the Russian public. I sometimes think if we were able to get through and were able to present them with some facts, I'm not saying that Western governments should tell them what to think, but if they had access to independent media, independent information, they might see the world completely differently. But they get their information mostly from Russian television, which gives them this sort of almost paranoid view of the world.
And just finally on this, Elizabeth, how difficult does that make it for us to get clear information about an event like this out of Russia?
A massive problem with the Russian government is that it so often obfuscates and even lies, that whenever information comes out of the Kremlin or the Russian armed forces, we almost have to assume today that it's incorrect. And this is a really difficult situation for Western governments, for the rest of the world, and dangerous situation also for Russia to be in, that everything the Kremlin puts out has to be taken with a grain of salt or not believed at all. I mean, this is not just any country, it's one of the world's most powerful countries, and yet we have to assume that what they say is only partially correct at best.
Okay, Elisabeth, thank you for your time tonight.